The sun was bright that morning, pouring its golden light across the quiet streets of a small city neighborhood. An elderly couple stepped out of their modest home, dressed in their best clothes. They were not rich, but they were proud people. For them, appearances mattered less than dignity. The husband wore a beige shirt with neat brown trousers, his hair silver, but combed with care. The wife wore a deep blue dress with a matching scarf that framed her gentle face. Their clothes were simple, but they carried themselves with quiet confidence. For weeks, they had been saving and talking about this day. It was not just about buying a car. It was about a dream, a symbol of everything they had worked for through decades of struggle. They had raised children, lived through hardship, and now, in their later years, they wanted to reward themselves. They had chosen a luxury car dealership not because they wanted to show off, but because they believed they had earned the right to experience the joy of sitting in a car that symbolized elegance and comfort. As they approached the dealership, they admired the glass building with its polished cars displayed under bright lights. The husband gently held his wife's hand and whispered, "We are finally here. Let us go inside and see what our hard work has given us." She smiled softly, feeling nervous yet excited. The moment they stepped through the tall glass doors, silence seemed to follow them. The staff behind the counters looked up, their eyes scanning the couple from head to toe. Some exchanged quick glances. Others smirked faintly as if they already had a judgment formed in their minds. The couple did not notice at first. They were too busy looking at the shining cars lined up like jewels, their glossy paint reflecting the showroom lights. The husband moved closer to a sleek black sedan, his fingers itching to touch the smooth surface. His wife, with childlike wonder, admired a white luxury car with delicate curves that reminded her of a swan. Then it happened. A man in a sharp black suit stormed toward them. He had the air of authority, his silver hair slicked back, and his voice sharp like a blade. Without greeting, without kindness, he raised his voice so that everyone in the showroom could hear. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. His eyes narrowed as he looked them over. "This is not a place for people like you." The words cut deep, though spoken casually, almost as if he believed them to be facts. The couple froze, their joy immediately drained. The husband tried to speak, his voice calm but firm. "We are here to look at cars. We wish to buy one." The manager scoffed loudly, throwing his hands in the air. "Buy. These cars cost more than your entire life savings. Do not waste my time." He gestured toward the door, his face turning red with irritation. The wife lowered her gaze, her heart sinking. She had been nervous already, but now her nervousness turned into shame. She wished to disappear, to hide from the stares of strangers who now watched them like a spectacle. The husband straightened his shoulders. He had lived long enough to know the taste of disrespect, but still, he wanted to stand his ground. "Sir," he said quietly, "we are customers. You should not treat us this way." That only fueled the man's anger. He stepped closer, his voice rising like thunder. "Customers, do not make me laugh. Look at yourselves. Do you think you belong here? Get out before I call security." By now, the entire dealership had gone silent. The staff stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their positions, while others wore smirks as if they found entertainment in the humiliation of the elderly couple. The wife's hands trembled as she held onto her husband's arm. She whispered, "Let us go." Her voice cracked with pain. The husband looked into her eyes, then back at the manager. His pride battled with his love for peace. He wanted to argue, to shout, to remind the man that appearances do not define worth. But in that moment, he chose dignity over confrontation. Slowly he nodded. "We will leave," he said, his voice steady, though his heart felt heavy. The couple turned and began walking toward the glass doors, their heads lowered. Each step felt like a blow, not because they could not afford a car, but because they had been judged, humiliated, and thrown aside like they were nothing. Behind them, the manager smirked with satisfaction, muttering under his breath, "That is what I thought," his words, though quiet, carried through the silence, piercing the couple like arrows. Outside, The bright sun still shone, but to them, the world felt darker. The husband led his wife gently to a bench nearby, where she sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "Why did he treat us that way?" she whispered. "We did nothing wrong." The husband sighed deeply. His shoulders felt heavier than ever before. Because some people see only what is on the surface. They do not see hearts, or lives, or stories. They see clothes, skin, and age. That is all. The wife leaned her head against his shoulder, silent tears running down her face. The humiliation cut deep, not just because of the insult, but because it reminded them of struggles they thought they had left behind. For several minutes, they sat there quietly, watching expensive cars drive past, their engines humming like a reminder of the dream they had been denied. They felt small and visible, defeated. But what the dealership manager did not know, what no one inside that building could have guessed, was that this couple's story was far from over. Their quiet dignity hid a powerful truth. They had raised a grandson who had grown into a man the world respected, a man who had built his own empire through discipline, vision, and relentless hard work. And when he would hear what happened to his grandparents, when he would learn how they were humiliated and cast aside, he would not stay silent. That night, as the couple returned home, their faces tired and hearts heavy, they sat together in silence. Their home was modest, filled with the warmth of family photos and memories. The husband stared at the wall for a long time, lost in thought. The wife quietly prepared tea, her hands still trembling. Then the phone rang. It was their grandson, checking in on them like he always did. The moment he heard the break in his grandmother's voice, the moment he sensed the weight in his grandfather's silence, he knew something terrible had happened. "Tell me," he said firmly, "what happened today?" And so they told him. Every word, every insult, every moment of shame. When they finished, silence filled the line. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm building, silence heavy with determination. The grandson's voice finally came, calm but strong. "Do not worry. Tomorrow, I will come with you, and they will never forget who you are." The couple exchanged glances, unsure of what he meant. But in their hearts, a small flame of hope flickered again, because they knew their grandson. And when he made a promise, he kept it. The humiliation of that day would not be the final chapter. It would only be the beginning of a story that would inspire many. Asterisk. The night after the humiliation at the dealership was one of the heaviest nights the elderly couple had lived through in years. Their modest home, usually filled with quiet laughter and warm conversations, now felt heavy with silence. The wife sat in her favorite wooden chair by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The husband sat on the couch, staring into the distance. Neither of them spoke for a long time because the memory of that afternoon replayed again and again in their minds like a wound that refused to close. The husband thought about the manager's face, the sharp tone of his voice, and the cruel words that were thrown at them in front of strangers. He had faced many challenges in life, but this one cut deep because it was not just a rejection of their ability to buy a car. It was a rejection of their worth as human beings. His wife, though quiet by nature, could not hide the sadness in her eyes. She had tried to be strong at the dealership, but when she had sat on the bench outside with tears falling freely, it had broken something inside her. She had lived her life with grace, working tirelessly beside her husband, raising children, teaching them values, and hoping the world would be kinder to them than it had been to her generation. Yet today, the world had shown her that cruelty still existed in its rawest form. They drank their tea in silence that evening, each sip tasting bitter. They wanted to pretend it did not matter, to shrug it off. But the truth was, it mattered deeply. For them, buying that car was not just about owning a vehicle. It was about celebrating their long journey together. It was about finally rewarding themselves after years of sacrifice. They had dreamed of sitting in a car that reflected the dignity they felt inside. Instead, they had been pushed away as if they were intruders, as if they were invisible, as the wife sat by the window. She whispered almost to herself, Why does it always have to be this way? Why must people judge us by how we look, by the clothes we wear, instead of the life we have lived? Her husband did not answer at first. He simply looked down at his calloused hands, hands that had built their life, hands that had never known idleness. Then he said quietly, because some people are blind. They cannot see hearts, only surfaces. They cannot hear stories, only the noise of their own arrogance. The pain of the day lingered in their bones. They tried to sleep, but the night was restless. The husband turned again and again in bed, unable to escape the echo of that man's voice telling them they did not belong. His wife lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with the memory of the smirks and stares of strangers in the showroom. Every look had told her the same story, that she and her husband did not deserve to be there. It was not only the insult of one man, but the silent approval of everyone who had watched without saying a word. But even in that pain, there was a quiet strength. The husband, though humiliated, did not let anger consume him. He held his wife's hand in the dark and whispered, "Do not let them take our peace. We know who we are. We know what we have built." His words were meant to comfort, but the truth was, he was trying to convince himself to. Because deep down, he felt the sting of being made small, and it gnawed at him. The next morning, their grandson called. He had a habit of checking in on them often, asking how they were doing, making sure they never felt alone. This time, when his grandmother's voice trembled as she answered, he immediately knew something was wrong. "Grandma, what happened?" he asked softly. She hesitated, not wanting to worry him, but the pain was too heavy to hide. Slowly, she told him everything. Her words were broken, interrupted by moments of silence when the memories became too sharp. She told him about the manager's insults, the shame of being shouted at in public, and the way they had walked out of the showroom with their heads down. The grandson listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not rush her. But as she spoke, his heart burned with anger. Not the kind of anger that lashes out blindly, but the kind that simmers deep inside, waiting for the right moment to act. He had always respected his grandparents more than anyone in the world. They were the ones who had taught him discipline, kindness, and the importance of hard work. They had raised him with love, given him values that guided his every step, and stood by him when life was difficult. And now, hearing how they had been humiliated, he felt a fire ignite within him. When his grandmother finished speaking, there was silence on the phone. For a moment, she feared he was too shocked to respond. Then his voice came, calm but filled with a strength she had heard only a few times before. "Do not worry. Tomorrow, we will go back together. And I promise you, they will never forget who you are." His words surprised her. She had not expected him to react with such certainty. She glanced at her husband, who was listening nearby, and repeated what their grandson had said. The old man nodded slowly, his lips tightening into a faint smile. He knew his grandson. When he made a promise, he meant it. That night, though the pain of humiliation still lingered, a small light of hope returned to their hearts. They did not know what exactly their grandson planned to do, but they trusted him. They had seen him rise from nothing to become someone respected and admired. He had built his own empire through sheer determination, and he had always carried himself with humility. If he said tomorrow would be different, then tomorrow would indeed be different. But even with hope, the pain was not gone. As they sat together in their living room, surrounded by the photos of their family on the walls, they reflected on the meaning of what had happened. The wife said softly, "We taught our children and grandchildren that respect is the greatest treasure a person can have. But today, we were treated as if we had none." Her husband shook his head gently. "We still have it. One man's cruelty cannot erase the respect we have earned in a lifetime. He may not see it, but we do not need his eyes to validate who we are." They spent the rest of the evening talking quietly, reminding themselves of their journey. They remembered the long years of work, the sacrifices, the nights they had gone without so their children could have more. They remembered the struggles of raising a family in a world that was not always kind to people like them. And though the humiliation at the dealership had cut deep, they reminded themselves that their story was not defined by one man's arrogance. Still, the sting of that day stayed with them. The way the other customers had stared, the way no one had spoken up for them, the way they had been walked out of the building as if they were intruders. These memories pressed on their hearts like heavy stones. And yet beneath the pain, there was a quiet strength. The strength that had carried them through every hardship in life. The wife, before going to bed that night, whispered a prayer. She prayed not for wealth or revenge, but for dignity and peace. She prayed that tomorrow would bring healing and that her grandson would be safe in whatever he planned to do. When they finally lay down to sleep, the house felt a little less heavy. There was still pain, but now there was also anticipation. Something was coming, something that would change the way the world saw them, not because they needed validation, but because the truth would finally be revealed. For now, though, they closed their eyes with the memory of pain still fresh in their hearts. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring justice in a way they had never imagined. Asterisk. The next morning came quietly, the sun rising slowly over the rooftops and painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. The elderly couple sat at their breakfast table, still carrying the weight of what had happened at the dealership. The humiliation had left a bruise on their hearts. But the words of their grandson from the night before echoed like a small flame of hope. He had promised to make things right. He had spoken with such confidence, and although they did not know exactly what he meant, they trusted him. Trust was all they had ever given him, from the time he was a child running barefoot in their backyard to the man he had become. As they sipped their morning tea, a knock came at the door. The husband rose slowly, his knees stiff with age, and opened it to find his grandson standing there. He was dressed sharply, not in arrogance but in quiet authority. His suit was simple, yet refined, his shoes polished, and his face calm but determined. The moment his grandmother saw him, her eyes filled with tears. She stood and embraced him tightly, holding on to him as if her pain could be washed away in that single hug. The grandson sat with them, listening once again as they retold the story. This time, his grandfather spoke more, his voice heavy but steady. He described the way the manager had shouted at them, the way the entire showroom had watched without lifting a finger to stop it, and the way they had walked out with lowered heads. Each word made the grandson's jaw tighten, though he kept his composure. He did not want to show them anger. He wanted to show them strength. Finally, when they had finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Grandpa, Grandma, you have carried dignity your whole life. You taught me that dignity is not given by others. It is built by the life you live. Yesterday that man tried to strip it away from you, but he cannot succeed. Because dignity is not his to take. But now it is my turn to show him what he failed to see." His grandparents looked at him curiously. The grandmother placed her hand on his arm and asked softly, "What do you mean, my child?" The grandson smiled gently, though his eyes held a fire. "I have kept a part of my life away from most people, even from you, because I wanted peace for this family. I did not want you to carry the burden of my success. But maybe it is time you knew. I am not just the boy you raised. I am the man who built a company from nothing, a company that grew and gave me wealth most people cannot imagine. I am not saying this with pride. I am saying it because tomorrow, when we walk back into that dealership together, I will not walk as just your grandson. I will walk as a man who can stand against their arrogance and show them that respect. It's worth more than any car." The room fell silent. His grandfather looked at him with wide eyes, surprised but not doubtful. He had always known his grandson was special, but hearing the truth out loud was overwhelming. His grandmother's hands trembled as she absorbed his words. She had always seen his humility and his kindness, but she had never imagined the extent of what he had achieved. For a moment, she was lost for words. The grandson continued, his voice calm. "Do you know what wealth really means to me? It is not the cars, not the houses, not the money in the bank. Wealth is the ability to protect the people I love, to give them what they deserve, and to stand against those who think they can trample others. You gave me everything: your love, your guidance, your sacrifices. Without you, I would be nothing. So now it is my turn. Tomorrow, we will go together, and I will not let them look down on you again." The grandfather leaned forward, his eyes glistening. My boy, we never asked for riches. All we ever wanted was for you to live a life of meaning. And you have. That is enough for us." The grandson shook his head gently. "And because you never asked, that is why I want to give. Not to prove anything to the world, but to honor you. That dealership will learn that they cannot treat people the way they treated you. They will learn that appearances mean nothing when character is everything." The grandparents sat in silence, their hearts swelling with pride. For years they had raised him with patience, teaching him the value of honesty, humility, and hard work. They had told him stories of struggle and resilience, hoping he would grow into a man of integrity. And now, sitting before them, they saw the fruit of all their sacrifices. Their pain from the dealership had not vanished, but it was now mixed with a sense of comfort. They were not alone. They had a grandson who carried their legacy forward, stronger than ever. That day passed slowly, with the grandparents preparing themselves for what was to come. They still felt nervous at the thought of walking back into the same dealership that had humiliated them. Now there was a difference. They would not be walking in alone, and they would not be walking in with lowered heads. Their grandson's presence was a shield, and his determination was a promise. In the evening, the grandson spoke again. He told them stories they had never heard before, of long nights spent building his business, of failures that had nearly broken him, and of victories that had finally lifted him into success. He shared how he had once lived in a small apartment, eating the simplest meals, working endlessly on an idea no one believed in. He told them how he had faced rejection, doubt, and scorn, but how he had never let go of the lessons they had given him. "Every time I wanted to quit," he said, "I thought of you too. I thought of how you never quit no matter how hard life was. And that gave me the strength to keep going." His grandparents listened with tears in their eyes. They had always believed their grandson was hardworking, but hearing the details of his journey filled them with awe. They realized that the same values they had lived by had carried forward into him, shaping his destiny. When night came, the grandmother prayed again, but this time her prayer was different. She no longer prayed only for dignity and peace. She prayed in gratitude for the strength of her grandson, for the love that bound their family together, and for the chance to see tomorrow bring a lesson to those who had wronged them. The grandson left their home late that evening, promising to return in the morning. As they watched him walk away, the grandfather whispered to his wife, "He is not just our grandson anymore. He is the man we dreamed he would become." And though they were still wounded from the cruelty they had faced, they felt something stronger now, a quiet pride that no insult could erase. Tomorrow would not erase the pain of the past, but it would rewrite the story. Tomorrow would show the world who they truly were, through the strength of the boy they had raised into a man. As they finally went to bed, they felt lighter than they had in days. The humiliation had hurt them, but their grandson's secret had given them hope. And hope, when it shines, can make even the deepest wounds begin to heal. The next morning carried a different kind of energy. The elderly couple woke early, though they had hardly slept. The memory of humiliation still pressed on their hearts, but the promise of their grandson gave them strength. For the first time since that awful day at the dealership, they felt a reason to lift their heads again. The husband dressed in his cleanest shirt, the wife tied her scarf neatly, and together they waited for their grandson. They did not know what exactly he planned to do, but they trusted him with their whole being. Soon, the sound of a car engine hummed outside their home. When they stepped to the window, they saw their grandson's car waiting. It was not flashy, not meant to draw attention, but it was elegant and carried the mark of success. He stepped out, his presence calm but commanding, and walked to the door with a quiet smile. His grandparents greeted him warmly, and though they tried to hide their nerves, he could see the weight of yesterday still in their eyes. He assured them gently, "Today will be different. Today, you will walk out with your heads higher than ever before." They set off together, the grandson driving with steady hands while his grandparents sat in the back. The ride was quiet at first, filled with a mixture of tension and anticipation. The grandmother held her husband's hand tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. The grandfather gazed out of the window, his eyes sharp, replaying the moment they had been forced out of the dealership. This time, though, there was no surrender in his expression. This time, there was resolve. When the dealership came into view, the glass building gleamed in the sunlight, as though mocking their pain from yesterday. The grandmother's grip on her husband's hand tightened. She remembered the manager's voice, the cruel laughter, the silent stares. But before fear could take hold, she looked at her grandson in the driver's seat. His jaw was steady, his eyes focused. In him, she saw not only the boy she had once raised, but the man who had grown into their shield. The car slowed and came to a stop outside the dealership. Conversations inside the showroom quieted as heads turned toward the entrance. The staff noticed the vehicle, sleek and polished, and their expressions shifted from indifference to curiosity. The glass doors slid open, and the grandson stepped out first, followed closely by his grandparents. The room seemed to pause as the elderly couple walked in once again. This time with someone who carried an unmistakable aura of authority. The same manager from yesterday spotted them. His face changed immediately, confusion mixing with irritation. He had not expected to see them return. He smirked, as though ready to repeat his insults. But then his eyes caught the grandson, who carried himself with a quiet confidence that unsettled him. The manager straightened his tie, forcing a smile, trying to regain his control over the situation. "Welcome," he said, his voice oily. "How can I help you today?" The grandson did not return the false smile. He looked directly at the man, his voice calm but firm. "You can help us by treating my grandparents with the respect they deserve. Yesterday you forgot what it means to serve customers. Today, I am here to remind you." The words rang clear, and the entire showroom turned to listen. Staff members stopped what they were doing, and even customers browsing cars turned their attention to the confrontation. The manager chuckled nervously, trying to brush it off. "There must be some misunderstanding. We welcome everyone here. Perhaps my tone was—" "Do not lie," the grandson interrupted, his voice sharper now, but still controlled. "You shouted at them. You humiliated them in front of everyone. You told them they did not belong here. I am here to show you just how wrong you were." The grandparents stood behind him, their hearts pounding. The grandfather placed his hand gently on his grandson's shoulder, as if to steady him, but also as if to draw strength from him. The grandmother's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She had never seen anyone stand up for them in such a way, not with such confidence and power. The grandson then turned, walking toward the nearest display of luxury cars. His footsteps echoed across the polished floor, each step carrying a weight that silenced the room further. He stopped by a gleaming Rolls-Royce, its silver body shining like a jewel under the lights. He ran his hand gently over its surface and turned back to the manager. "I will take this one," he said firmly. Then, with a pause, he pointed to another model in black, equally magnificent. "And that one too. One for my grandfather, and one for my grandmother." Gasps filled the room. Staff exchanged stunned glances. Customers whispered in disbelief. The manager's face drained of color. For a moment, he struggled to find words, his earlier arrogance collapsing under the weight of the scene. He stammered, "Why, you mean both paid in full?" The grandson's eyes locked on him. "Yes, paid in full. In their names. And I want the paperwork started immediately." The dealership fell into a flurry of motion. Staff rushed to prepare documents, their hands trembling with the realization of what was unfolding. The grandparents stood frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Their dream, which had been crushed yesterday, was now being resurrected before their eyes in a way they had never imagined. The manager, desperate to save face, tried to smile again. "Of course, sir, of course. If I may just say, we value all our customers." The grandson cut him off once more. "You value money, but money without respect is worthless. My grandparents came here yesterday with dignity. They did not need me or anyone else to prove their worth. But you could not see that. You looked only at their clothes, their age, and their skin. And for that, you showed them cruelty. Remember this moment, because money can buy cars, but it cannot buy respect. That is something you failed to give." The manager's head lowered, his arrogance stripped away. The staff around him avoided his gaze, ashamed by what they had witnessed and allowed the previous day. Customers nodded quietly, some even clapping softly in support. The grandparents, standing tall behind their grandson, felt a sense of pride they had never experienced before. The humiliation of yesterday was being washed away, not just by the purchase of cars, but by the truth being spoken aloud for all to hear, as the paperwork was signed and finalized. The grandson remained calm, his focus entirely on his grandparents. He guided them gently to sit, ensuring they were comfortable, speaking to them with the same respect he demanded from others. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He was not there to boast of his wealth. He was there to restore the dignity that had been stolen from them. When the keys were finally handed over, one set placed in his grandfather's trembling hands, the other in his grandmother's, their eyes filled with tears. The grandfather whispered, his voice cracking, "We do not need these cars to prove anything, but thank you, my boy. Thank you for standing for us." The grandmother clutched the keys to her chest, her heart too full for words. The grandson smiled gently. "This is not about cars. This is about reminding the world who you are. You gave me everything. Today, I am only giving back a little. Together." They walked out of the dealership, this time not with lowered heads, but with shoulders straight and eyes lifted. Outside, the sun seemed brighter, the world seemed lighter, and their steps carried a dignity no one could ever take away again. The humiliation of yesterday had turned into the triumph of today, and it was a memory they would carry forever. The air inside the dealership was heavy even after the papers had been signed. The staff continued to move about, pretending to carry on with their usual duties. But their eyes kept returning to the elderly couple and their grandson. It was not every day that 2 Rolls-Royces were purchased at once, and certainly not in such a dramatic way. Whispers filled the corners of the room, soft murmurs of astonishment, disbelief, and even quiet admiration. The grandson stood tall, his presence unshaken. He did not carry himself like a man flaunting wealth, but rather like someone delivering a lesson. His grandparents sat quietly nearby, their hands still clutching the keys that had been handed to them. They looked at each other, almost unable to believe that the humiliation they had endured yesterday had transformed into this extraordinary moment today. It was as if life itself had chosen to write a different ending for them. The manager, who had been the source of their pain, remained standing awkwardly a few feet away. His once confident demeanor was now reduced to nervousness. His cheeks burned, his lips tightened, and his eyes darted around, avoiding direct contact with the grandson. He had no clever words left, no arrogance to shield him. The mask had slipped, and everyone could see the truth that he had misjudged, is mistreated and dishonored to people who deserved none of it. The grandson turned slowly, his eyes fixed on the manager. The silence in the room deepened, and the sound of his footsteps as he walked closer seemed to echo louder than anything else. When he stopped in front of the man, he spoke with a calm yet commanding voice that carried across the entire showroom. "Yesterday, you looked at my grandparents, and you saw nothing. You saw clothes that did not shine, skin that did not fit your shallow standards, and age that you mistook for weakness. You saw all of this, and you decided they were not worthy of respect. But what you failed to see was the truth. The truth that these 2 people have lived lives richer than any car in this showroom. The truth that they built a family, they raised children, and they gave me the values that allowed me to stand here today. Without them, I would not be the man I am. Without them, none of this would exist." The manager shifted uncomfortably, but he could not look away. The grandson's voice was steady, his words sharp, but not shouted. He was not humiliating the man in return. He was revealing the weight of his mistake for all to hear. "My grandparents are not people you dismiss. They are not people you throw out because you believe they cannot afford what you sell. They are the reason I learned that money is only a tool, not the measure of a person. They taught me that respect is given freely, not because of what someone has, but because of who someone is. Yesterday you failed them. Today, I hope you understand that you failed yourself even more." A hush swept over the crowd. Some of the staff lowered their eyes in shame, while a few nodded quietly as though acknowledging the lesson they had just heard. Even customers who had nothing to do with the situation stood still, their expressions softened by the power of the words. The grandmother, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, could feel tears building in her eyes. Not tears of sadness this time, but tears of pride. To hear her grandson speak with such conviction, to see him defend her and her husband in front of the very people who had tried to strip them of dignity, was more than she could have ever dreamed. The grandfather sat quietly beside her, his face lined with age but glowing with a pride that could not be hidden. For years he had taught his grandson about character and humility, and now those lessons were shining brighter than any polished car in the showroom. The grandson paused, letting his words linger in the air before turning away from the manager. He walked back to his grandparents, knelt slightly so he was at eye level with them, and said gently, "You deserve more than this place ever tried to give you. Today is not about cars. Today is about reminding you and reminding them that you are the reason I stand here. You are the true foundation of everything I am." His grandmother reached out and touched his face with trembling fingers. "You were always our pride," she whispered. "Not because of what you have, but because of who you are," his grandfather added softly. "And today you proved that again." The grandson smiled, his eyes softening for the first time that day. "Then let us leave this place with our heads high. Because there is nothing left for us here but memories we will not carry anymore." The three of them stood. And as they did, something remarkable happened. A few customers began to clap, slow at first but growing louder. The sound filled the showroom, breaking the silence that had hung heavy in the air. It was not applause for the wealth spent, but for the truth spoken, for the dignity restored, and for the quiet strength of a family that had refused to be broken. The manager looked around, his face flushed with embarrassment as the applause continued. He could do nothing but stand there, forced to witness the respect he had denied being freely given by strangers. For the first time he understood the depth of his failure, though the weight of it was his to carry alone. As the applause faded, the grandson helped his grandparents walk toward the exit. They moved slowly, their steps steady and proud. No one dared stop them, no one dared speak against them. The glass doors opened wide, and sunlight spilled onto them as they stepped out into the open air. Outside, two gleaming Rolls-Royces stood ready, their engines purring softly as if waiting for the moment they would become symbols of more than just wealth. The grandson handed the keys to his grandparents, guiding them toward the cars with a smile that was both gentle and strong. His grandfather placed a hand on the roof of the silver Rolls-Royce, his fingers tracing the surface as though it were a dream made real. His grandmother opened the door of the black one, pausing for a moment before sitting inside, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Reporters and photographers, drawn by the spectacle, had begun to gather outside. Cameras clicked, questions were shouted, but the grandson ignored them all. This was not for the world to consume like a piece of news. This was for his grandparents, for the dignity that belonged to them alone. As the couple sat in their cars, tears rolling quietly down their cheeks, the grandson stood between them, his eyes lifted toward the sky. He thought of the boy he once was, sitting at his grandparents' table, listening to their stories of perseverance. He thought of the nights he had almost given up, but remembered their sacrifices and kept going. And now, here he was, giving back a fraction of what they had given him. The revelation was not just about his wealth. It was about the truth that money meant nothing without love, respect, and family. It was about the lesson that dignity cannot be stolen by arrogance. It's because dignity lives in the soul, not in the hands of others. And as the sun shone down on them, the grandson knew that this moment would live forever in their hearts, not as a memory of cars, but as a memory of love, pride, and unshakable respect. Asterisk. The drive away from the dealership was not like any other drive the elderly couple had taken in their lives. For the first time, they sat inside cars that had only existed in their dreams. The leather seats felt smooth beneath them, the scent of newness filled the air, and the quiet purr of the engine was like a song of triumph. But it was not the luxury that made their hearts swell. It was what those cars represented. They were symbols of respect restored, dignity reclaimed, and a story rewritten in front of the very eyes that had once looked down on them. The grandson drove slowly ahead, guiding his grandparents behind him as they moved through the streets. People turned to stare at the sight of two Rolls-Royces gliding side by side. driven by an elderly couple who looked both overwhelmed and proud. For the grandparents, every turn of the wheel felt like a victory. Yesterday, they had walked out of that dealership with lowered heads. Today they were leaving it in the finest cars it offered, their dignity not just intact, but shining brighter than ever. When they reached home, neighbors gathered to see what had happened. The quiet street, once used to the ordinary rhythm of daily life, now buzzed with astonishment. Children ran to the gates, pointing with wide eyes, while adults whispered in disbelief. Some knew of the couple's humiliation the day before. News of it had traveled fast, but none could have predicted what came after. To see them now, arriving with two gleaming cars, was like watching justice unfold in the most unexpected way. The grandson stepped out first, his face calm, not gloating, not boastful. He greeted the neighbors with respect, as he always had, but his presence carried a new weight. His grandparents stepped out next, holding the keys in their trembling hands, their eyes filled with gratitude. The wife could barely contain her tears, and the husband, though trying to stay composed, could not hide the smile that crept onto his face. The neighbors approached, some clapping, others simply standing in awe. One elderly man shook his head and said, "This is not about cars. This is about respect. This is about teaching the world a lesson." His words spread quickly through the crowd, and soon everyone agreed. What had happened was bigger than wealth, bigger than luxury. It was a reminder of something timeless, that human dignity must never be measured by appearances. Later that evening, family gathered in the couple's home. Their children, grandchildren, and even distant relatives filled the small living room. Laughter and chatter replaced the silence that had haunted the house the night before. The cars outside were admired, of course, but soon they became only part of a larger conversation. Everyone wanted to hear the story from beginning to end. The grandparents, with emotions still fresh in their voices, described what had happened, the humiliation, the pain, and then the moment their grandson had stood tall and turned everything around. Each detail brought gasps, tears, finally applause. The grandson sat quietly as they spoke, listening without interruption. He did not want the story to be about him. He wanted it to be about them, about the lesson that had been carved into the heart of that day. But when his grandmother finished, her voice breaking with emotion, she looked at him and said, "Tell them what you told us. Tell them why you did it." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He took a breath and spoke slowly, his voice steady. "I did it because of everything you taught me. You showed me that respect is the foundation of life. You showed me that no matter how little you have, if you carry yourself with dignity, you are richer than anyone who looks down on others. Yesterday, when they humiliated you, I saw more than just disrespect toward people I love. I saw the proof of how blind the world can be. I wanted to remind us that money does not decide worth. Character does. And if I have money today, it is only because you raised me with values that no one can buy." There was a hush in the room, followed by nods, tears, and quiet murmurs of agreement. His words resonated with everyone present. They were not just words for his grandparents. They were words for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, judged, or dismissed. The grandfather spoke then, his voice soft but powerful. "We never asked for riches, my boy. We never needed cars or luxury. What we always wanted was to live with respect. Yesterday, we lost it for a moment. But today, you gave it back. And you gave more than that. You gave us the lesson that sometimes the world must be shown the truth in a language it understands." Everyone understood what he meant. The dealership had understood money but failed to understand humanity. It had taken the sight of two Rolls-Royces being purchased in one moment to shake them, to force them to see the people they had dismissed. And though the grandson had used wealth as the tool, it was not about the purchase itself. It was about the message it carried. As the night grew darker, the family continued to talk, sharing stories and memories. The grandparents smiled more than they had in weeks, their faces glowing with pride. The grandson stayed by their side, not once allowing the attention to shift to his success, always pointing back to their sacrifices, their love, their role in shaping him. When the house finally quieted and the family dispersed, The grandson sat with his grandparents one last time before leaving. The grandmother took his hand and whispered, "You gave us more than cars. You gave us back our dignity," the grandfather added. "And you gave the world a lesson it will not forget." The grandson smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Then my mission is complete, because nothing matters more to me than you." The lesson of that day spread far beyond their home. Neighbors told neighbors, stories traveled across communities, and soon it became more than a family tale. It became an example, a reminder, an inspiration. People repeated the story not because of the cars, but because of the message behind them. They told it to their children, to their friends, to anyone who would listen. And each time it was told, it carried the same truth. Never judge a person by what you see on the surface. The dealership itself was never the same again. The staff who had witnessed the moment spoke of it quietly for weeks. Some ashamed of their silence, others changed by the memory. The manager, once arrogant, was left with a mark he could not erase. He had been exposed, not with anger or violence, but with truth and dignity. And in that exposure, he faced the harshest lesson of all, that the measure of a person is not in wealth or status, but in respect. The grandparents, though still humble and modest in every way, carried themselves differently now. They had always been proud, but now their pride was visible, shining in their posture, in their smiles, in the way they walked through the world. They no longer remembered only the pain of that day. They remembered the victory, the revelation, and the lesson that followed. And so, the story became larger than any of them had expected. It was not just about a couple or a grandson or even a dealership. It was about the timeless truth that respect is the greatest treasure a person can give or receive. It was about the lesson that arrogance will always fall when faced with dignity. And it was about love, the love of a grandson who refused to let his grandparents walk away in shame. Asterisk. The days that followed were unlike anything the elderly couple had ever experienced before. Their quiet neighborhood, which usually echoed only with the laughter of children playing and the sound of doors opening in the evening, now carried whispers of admiration and awe. People came to their home not to stare at the two Rolls-Royces parked proudly in front, but to meet them, to shake their hands, and to tell them how their story had touched their hearts. The humiliation of the dealership had become a distant shadow, replaced by the light of dignity that had returned to them. The grandmother often sat by the window now. The same window where she had once cried silently the night of her humiliation. This time, her tears were different. There were tears of gratitude, tears of pride. She would look at the cars outside, but in her heart, she saw more than steel and leather. She saw a message carved into history that no one has the right to strip away another's worth. The grandfather, too, felt the change deep in his bones. He had lived a life of hard work and sacrifice, and though he had never needed the world's validation, the sting of that day had hurt more than he had admitted. But now, when he walked through the market or greeted neighbors, people treated him with a new respect. Not because of the cars, but because they knew the truth of what had happened. They knew he had been wronged and then honored in the most powerful way. He held his head higher, not with arrogance, but with quiet dignity. The grandson continued to visit often. To him, the story was not about wealth or revenge. It was about love. Each time he sat with his grandparents, he reminded them of the same truth. What happened was not about showing off. It was about showing the world who you are. You gave me everything I have, and I will never let anyone treat you as less than you deserve. His words always brought soft smiles to their faces. They did not need the reminder, but they cherished the way he carried his gratitude like a torch. The story began to spread beyond their neighborhood. A local journalist heard about it and wrote an article. Soon, the tale of the couple and their grandson began appearing in newspapers, then on radio programs, and eventually on television. People from all walks of life heard about the elderly couple who had been dismissed and then honored, and they found themselves inspired. For many, it was a reminder of their own experiences of being underestimated or disrespected. For others, it was a story of justice that felt rare in a world where money too often overshadowed humanity. Letters began to arrive at the couple's home. Strangers wrote to say how deeply moved they were, how the story had given them courage to face their own struggles, how it had reminded them to treat others with more kindness. The couple read each letter slowly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter, always with humility. They had never imagined that their pain could become a lesson for the world. The dealership, too, felt the ripple of the story. The manager, who had once stood tall with arrogance, now found himself humbled. His name became tied to his mistake, and though he tried to move past it, he could never escape the memory of the day he had dismissed a people who later proved him wrong in front of the entire city. For the staff who had stood silently that day, the memory became a constant reminder that silence in the face of cruelty is as harmful as cruelty itself. The dealership changed its ways, training its staff to treat every person with respect, no matter their appearance. Whether it was genuine change or simply an attempt to repair its image, it did not matter. The lesson had been delivered, and it was one they could not ignore. The couple's family felt the impact too. Their children and other grandchildren looked at them with new eyes. Realizing the strength they carried, the quiet dignity that had always been there but now shone brighter, family gatherings became richer with stories, laughter, and a renewed sense of unity. The grandson, though already respected, became even more admired within the family, not for his wealth, but for his heart. He had proven that success means nothing without love, and that true honor is found in protecting those who once protected you. Years passed, and the story did not fade. It became a legacy, told again and again, not as a tale of cars, but as a lesson in humanity. The couple grew older, their hair whiter, their steps slower, but their dignity remained untouched. The cars, though still parked proudly, eventually became less important to them. What mattered most was the change the story had created in the hearts of those who heard it. The grandson continued to grow in his work, building his empire further, but he never let go of his roots. No matter how high he rose, he always returned to sit with his grandparents, to drink tea in their modest home, to listen to their wisdom. Whenever people asked him the secret to his success, he would always say, "It was not me. It was them. They gave me the values that shaped my life. All I did was carry them forward." In time, the couple passed down their wisdom to the next generation, teaching their great-grandchildren the same lessons they had once taught their grandson. They told the story of the dealership not to boast, but to remind the young ones that life will always test dignity, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not in fighting with anger, but in standing with truth. When the couple eventually grew too old to drive the Rolls-Royces, they did not sell them. They left them in the care of their grandson, who preserved them not as vehicles, but as symbols. He promised to keep them polished and protected, not because of their value, but because of what they represented. Every time he looked at them, he remembered that day, that lesson, and that moment when love and respect triumphed over arrogance. The legacy of the story lived on. It traveled through communities, across cities, even across countries. People who had never met the couple or their grandson told the story as if it belonged to them. And in a way it did, because it carried a lesson universal to all that dignity is the true wealth of a person. That respect cannot be measured in money, and that love has the power to rewrite even the most painful of stories. And so, long after the dealership incident had faded into the past, the story of the couple and their grandson remained alive, not as gossip, not as news, but as inspiration. It became a guiding light for those who had been disrespected, a reminder for those who were tempted to judge, and a comfort for those who felt unseen. For the grandson, it remained a private memory, treasured more deeply than any success he achieved. For the grandparents, it became the crown of their lives, the proof that the values they had lived by had not been in vain. And for the world, it became a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth carrying forward, because in the end, the true legacy was not the wealth, not the cars, not even the dramatic return to the dealership. The true legacy was the lesson that lived on in every heart it touched. Respect everyone, no matter who they are, because dignity is priceless and love is eternal.